I really prayed about what the Lord would have me share, and I felt as though it was essential that we talked and revisited the passage of Ezekiel 38 and 39, the battle of Gog of Magog. We often say the battle of Gog and Magog, which is how it's worded in Revelation. That's actually a different battle that takes place at the end of the millennium. But this passage here, this battle in Ezekiel 38 and 39, is something that takes place prior to the return of Jesus. And so for anyone who has been studying prophecy for any amount of time, you're probably quite familiar with this passage, but I want to look at it afresh. I believe that this is one of the most essential Old Testament passages. I believe this is, if I can use the phrase, the Armageddon of the Old Testament. And even in saying that, there's probably some red flags that go up, but we're going to really look at the passage, and I believe this message will be a bit of all three of the Berean and the Issachar, as well as the applicational. And I believe that this passage has a lot of all of the above. So what I've done here is I've just made a timeline so you can see what I call the popular view. And this is the view that most of us were raised on, that we've seen in most of the books that are discussing this and the teachings that most teachers are teaching, which is essentially that in terms of that final week, that final 7 years prior to the return of Jesus and the Battle of Armageddon, at either just before or just after that period, you have what's called the Battle of Gog of Magog. This is what most are teaching, that it begins, it's an event that's very brief, and it takes place just prior or sometime just immediately after the beginning of that 7-year time frame. And then it's taught that these armies, this invasion is thwarted, that it's supernaturally destroyed, and that this opens the way for the coming of the Antichrist. So how many have never heard this scenario? So pretty much everybody in here is on board. I want to look at this and see if this holds up against the criteria of Scripture. I really want to look at the passages and say, is this scriptural? I mean, this is widely held, widely believed. It's almost orthodoxy. I mean, don't even touch this view. Now, I want to begin by just highlighting the fact that the Jewish view, that the rabbis and sages down through history have always looked at Gog of Magog not as a preliminary, penultimate invader of Israel, but rather the ultimate final enemy of the people of God. The Jewish view has always been that this is the final, not the secondary, as opposed to the Christian view, the popular Christian view. And I'm actually going to argue for this particular view, the Jewish view, that Gog of Magog is simply another retelling of the Antichrist story, and that Gog is the Antichrist, and this invasion spoken of by Ezekiel is the same story that all of the other prophets are talking about. Now, granted, they're all emphasizing different aspects of the story. Some are using a wide-angle lens, some are using a fisheye, some are focusing on this or that, but they're all basically telling a very Day of the Lord centric story. It's a story that very much revolves around the return of Jesus and the events that precede His coming. And Ezekiel is no different than any of the other prophets. So just for reference, I threw up a quote from the Talmud. We could look at dozens of references from the various rabbis and commentators. And it says, "Behold, a king shall go up from the land of Magog at the end of days. He will assemble kings wearing crowns and lieutenants wearing armor, and all the nations shall obey him. They shall array battle in the land of Israel against the children of the dispersion, but the Lord will be ready for them. And then their dead bodies shall fall upon the mountains of the land of Israel. The wild beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens shall come and consume them. After that, all the dead of Israel will be resurrected and shall enjoy the good things that were secretly set aside for them from the beginning." So just, a very brief overview. That story that at the very end, you have Gog coming up. They're destroyed. The birds of the air, the beasts of the field feast on them. No different than what is referenced in Revelation 19, which is the quintessential New Testament passage speaking of the Battle of Armageddon. This feast of the birds and the beasts of the air, by the way, are in both passages. Revelation's essentially quoting almost verbatim. It's paraphrasing from Ezekiel 38, 39. And then after that comes the resurrection, the conclusion, the birth that all of creation has been longing for. So now I've listed three, what I will argue are three false beliefs concerning Gog of Magog. The first is that it is a Russian-led Islamic invasion. I will argue that it is an Islamic invasion and that the passage is not speaking of Russia. How many people are getting offended? You know, this is something that I held to for many years, that we've all been raised on. Second, that the battle of Gog of Magog happens before the coming of the Antichrist. We've already mentioned that. And then third, as a result of the destruction of these armies, and this is the application that I really want to get to, is that Islam as a religion will be annihilated and it will disappear and dry up and go away. So this is the application that the popular view is essentially holding to, because it's been difficult for Christians to wrestle with how does Islam fit into the end times. You know, you've got this global leader, this guy that's calling all people to obey him and submit to him. Where do the Muslims fit in? And nobody's been able to really figure out how to do that. And so on the prophecy side of the Christian church, they say, well, they're going to get destroyed and annihilated in the battle of Gog of Magog. And now many have added a combination of Psalm 83 with the battle of Gog of Magog. And then on the charismatic, personal prophecy side, they go, thus saith the Lord, just like, the Soviet Union fell, the Iron Curtain came down, so the whole Islamic world's just going to have this incredible revival, and they're all just going to get saved. And they kind of do this sort of thing. But essentially right now we have Islam, which is the fastest growing religious demographic in the earth. Meanwhile, the Western world is essentially aborting itself into oblivion. And then those in our churches, the young people, again, are leaving 2 out of 3 by the time they are in their 20s. And the Western church is shrinking. Now, it's growing in the global south. We need to highlight the fact. But the bottom line is Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. And it's largely due to birth rates. There's issues of conversion, yes, and there's revivals in the Islamic world. But Islam is still growing faster. We need to remember that while most Americans are having 1, 2 kids, Osama bin Laden was the 54th son of his father. 54th child, I'm sorry. The 54th child of his father. This is what we're up against. And when you have demographics like this, it doesn't take long before there are dramatic global shifts. And there's no signs that that's going to abate. So it's essential that we get this down. Is Islam about to be destroyed and go away, or is this thing of the juggernaut, the snowball, that's going to roll across the whole globe? That's a big difference that we need as those that are trying to discern what's taking place and want to know, like the sons of Issachar, what to do. We got to get this right. If we get this wrong, this is not just like we missed it a little bit. We're missing one of the most central, obvious issues right in front of us of our day. We need to get this issue right. So now we're going to begin to deal with who are the nations involved in this invasion. And so here are the nations that are listed. You have Gog, and he's of Magog. And then you have Meshech and Tubal, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Togarmah. And then it's very important that we highlight the fact that you also have, and many peoples or nations with you. So the nations listed in Ezekiel are not a comprehensive list. It lists several primary key players, and then it just sort of opens the door and says, and there's going to be many nations with you as well. But it lists some of the primary key players. Now, how do we determine what these ancient names represent? What nations today are they referring to? So the way that we begin to decipher this is we simply want to find out, where is Gog? Where is he from? Now, he is from Magog. Gog is of Magog. And most scholars say that Magog simply means the land of Gog, that it came from the Assyrian Matgugi or Matgugu, and that Gog was simply it's a term similar to Pharaoh. He was the ruler from the land of Magog. So here's the question, where is Magog? What is the Bible referring to? What is Ezekiel referring to when it says that this Gog is from Magog? So what I've done is thrown up a handful of maps from very popular prophecy teachers' books and websites. Really, all I did is I scoured Google looking for maps that highlight the popular position. And I want to be clear, in no way am I trying to pick on any of these teachers, but I just want you to see the commonly held view. So this particular map, this individual, he has Rosh, It's actually Rosh up in Russia, and then Magog over in Central Asia. So that's the Istan nations, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., etc. And that's Magog, and so really the former Soviet nations there that are Islamic. And then he's got Turkey, Persia, of course, which is Iran. I fully agree with that. Kush, northern Sudan, some would add Ethiopia or Somalia, and then Put, which is Libya, and then some would extend it to include more of northern Africa as well. But nevertheless, the primary leader of this invasion, as you can see, is placed up in Russia and the former Central Asian nations, the former Soviet Central Asian nations. Here's another map. I know it's a little bit grainy, but this teacher's got Magog up in Russia. He reverses what the previous teacher did. He's got Rosh down in Central Asia. He's got Magog up in Russia. And then in Turkey, he's got Gomer and Togarmah. Tubal, interestingly, he's got over there in Turkmenistan. I'm not sure where that idea comes from. And then you've got Persia, Ethiopia, or Kush. It's actually Sudan is more accurate, and then Libya. And they all descend, or they all come against Israel. This one here, Magog is placed in Russia, whereas interestingly, Gog is placed over in Europe. I'm not quite sure how that conclusion was arrived at, and then you've got just the Arab allies coming up out of northern Africa. Again, you've got Magog up in Russia, and then Gomer over in Germany. Now, the way that this was taught, I mean, this goes back, Hal Lindsey, this was sort of the popular view back in the 70s. And the way that this is arrived at, the way that teachers arrive at this view, is that all Semitic words have a three-letter root. Okay, so Gomer would be GMR, essentially. And so what they do is they say, Gomer, that sounds much like Germany, right? The problem with that, if there's any Germans here, is that the Germans are like, thanks a lot, American prophecy teachers, because, first of all, Germany would be GRM, but never mind that. Secondly, we call it Deutschland. You guys call it Germany. And so they're like, thank you for casting us as part of the coming Antichrist, Gog coalition. We appreciate it. And then you have Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah in Asia Minor extending over into Armenia. Now, what I've done is to contrast the popular prophecy books with a handful of very conservative evangelical Bible atlases, and I want you to just see the difference. Here's the New Moody Atlas of the Bible. Where's Magog? It's right in the heart of Asia Minor. That's modern-day Turkey. You also have Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. They're all in the modern-day nation of Turkey. Okay, that's the New Moody Atlas of the Bible. Now again, these Bible atlases are put together by teams of interdisciplinary scholars which pool their resources, and they don't have, let's say, a prophetic agenda. They're just trying to espouse what history recalls for us. Now you have the Zondervan Atlas of the Bible. Once again, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah. They're all right in Asia Minor. They're in Turkey, okay? Then you have the Holman Bible Atlas. Now, what I've done with these maps, by the way, is I've just altered them just enough so that I'm not infringing on copyright. If you look them up, this is identical to the locations that the atlases have placed them. And then you have Magog, Meshech, again, pretty much the same thing. They're slightly a little bit different. One might have Meshech a little more central, one's a little more, but for the most part, notice how the Bible atlases all basically agree that Magog was in ancient Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And the popular prophecy books have a general idea that it comes out of Russia, but then other than that, they're sort of all over the place. They agree on Put, Kush, and Persia. But then when it comes to all the other names, there's just quite a variety. Then you have the IVP Atlas of the Bible. Once again, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah. Pretty much all in modern-day Turkey. Now, this is amazingly simple. Why is there such a discrepancy between the atlases and the prophecy books? And it really comes down to a difference of methodology. How does how do the atlas, the guys that do the atlases, how do they arrive at their position versus how do the prophecy teachers that are putting out up in Russia, how do they arrive at their conclusion? And the difference is the first approach or methodology is what I call the bloodline lineage migration method. And so what that means is that most of the teachers, if you read them, they'll say, well, in the first century, for instance, with Magog, they'll say Josephus said that the Magog peoples were the Scythians. Now, the Scythians were a migratory people that once lived in Turkey, Asia Minor, but then they were pushed out and they migrated around the Black Sea. I guess for you it's this way, up around through Moldova, Ukraine, up into Russia, and then across the Russian steppes. They filled Russia. They eventually intermarried with the sort of Scandinavians that came down. Thus, you have the modern-day people of Russia. That's what people would say. So what it involves is the tracing of bloodlines and the migration. And this group, they intermarried here, and then they migrated up the Volga River Valley, and all these sort of things. And that's the bloodline lineage migration method. But here's the problem with that, is that most conservative Bible teachers today, any seminary, if you're just a good Sunday school student, then you know that the hermeneutic or the approach to interpreting Scripture that we want to use, which is responsible, is not this bloodline lineage sort of historical wild goose chase, which is subject, by the way, to the limitations of the historical record that we have. Rather, we want to use what's called the historical grammatical perspective. And what that means is this, is that we don't care what Josephus understood Magog to be 800 years after Ezekiel. What we care about is how Ezekiel understood it in his immediate Old Testament literate audience. We want to understand original context, okay? Because that was who the prophecy was given to. We need to understand what it meant and then apply it to ourselves today, okay? So the guys doing the Bible Atlas, they're using the historical grammatical perspective. And Ezekiel's Old Testament literate audience would have been thoroughly familiar. Their worldview would have been informed by where these peoples were in their day, as well as where they are placed according to the table of nations in Genesis 10. And so the overwhelming emphasis of the prophecy is on Asia Minor. And then you've got other nations around as well. Now, some people will say, they'll argue, they'll say, no, but there is room, there's validity to use the bloodline lineage method. And I want to touch on that in case anybody's still wrestling with it. But what I've done here is thrown up a map that if we are just consistently using the historical grammatical perspective, this is essentially what Ezekiel was laying out. You have this clear emphasis on the nation of Turkey, Asia Minor. And then you have Persia, right? That's modern-day Iran. Then you have Put and Cush, basically Libya. Again, you could include Algeria and Tunisia, possibly. Cush, modern-day northern Sudan. Biblically, Cush is the region immediately south of Egypt. It includes a bit of southern Egypt as well. And then there's the issue of Rosh, the word Rosh. Joel, you haven't touched on Rosh yet. So there has been, beyond the issue of Magog, there's also the issue of this one word that's in the text and how do we translate it. So for the past 100 years, there's been a debate among scholars. Do we interpret it as a proper noun referring to a place and thus call it Rosh, or do we simply translate it according to what it means in the Hebrew, which is chief? Now, 602 times throughout the Hebrew Scriptures is the word Rosh, and it's always translated as chief or head. In this one case, some have argued that it should be translated as Rosh. Now, it was translated Rosh in the Septuagint. So there is some historical precedent for that. But I want to show you how it's come down in some of the popular translations. You've got the King James Version, the NIV, and the ESV, which all translated as chief. And then you've got the NASB, New American Standard, and the New King James, which translated as a proper noun as Rosh. Now, about 15 years ago, a guy named Daniel Block, he's a Hebrew scholar, and I jokingly refer to him as an Ezekiel wizard. Okay, this guy is one of the just most brilliant Ezekiel minds out there. He devoted over 20 years of his life just to the book of Ezekiel. Came out with these two commentaries that are just fantastic, two-part commentary on Ezekiel. And he wrote this article, which was featured in one of the theological journals, where what he does is he synthesizes the arguments of those that say it should be a proper noun with those that say it should be essentially chief or an adjective, and he says they both have some valid arguments within, the field of Old Testament Hebrew. But his translation was essentially that it should be a noun, but a descriptive noun, not a proper noun. There's no room for it to be a proper noun. So this was the translation that he came up with. Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince, chief of Meshech Tubal. Now, I've had the chance to ask a couple Hebrew scholars, what is the consensus within the world, the field of Hebrew Old Testament scholarship? Because Hebrew Old Testament scholarship, just like any other science, it has advances. And universally what I've heard so far is they go, everyone accepts it. Like the idea that it's referring to a proper name, Rosh, is universally rejected. Like they go, one of the guys actually said to me, because the only people that still believe that are the populists. What he means is us. But in other words, because we've been raised on this. But here's the thing, guys, is we want to be students of the Scriptures, but we want to catch up with conservative evangelical scholarship. We don't want to just hold to a particular view because it's what, our team holds or what we've always been taught. We want to be responsible students of the Scriptures, right? Okay, so here's the thing. If we are using the historical grammatical perspective, if Rosh is a proper noun, in Ezekiel's day, the only Rosh peoples that anyone knows of was basically in Iran. There were a few small bands of Rosh peoples, and they were in basically Persia, modern-day Iran. Okay? So the only way that you can get there is you have to use the bloodline lineage migration method. Now here's the problem, and I've gone through, and again, I'm not picking on anybody, and I certainly won't mention any names, but I've gone through all the books, and I've said, okay, let's look at this guy's methodology, and is he consistent? And what it becomes is almost like a card trick. So what they'll do is go, okay, so like with Magog and Rosh, we're going to use the the bloodline lineage, and we're going to trace the bloodlines. But then with these other names like Persia, we're going to stick with the historical grammatical. And they switch back and forth. They switch methods. And most people reading it don't even realize there's a difference. And so they can produce the result that they want to produce. But the truth is the ancient Persian peoples that did live in Persia, they've migrated up into Europe. So here's the thing is, if you want to argue and say, no, that migration bloodline thing is valid, the problem with that is you have to be consistent. So if you want to say Magog are the Russians, okay, great. The problem is Gomer and all of these other Japhetic peoples, Caucasian peoples that are listed in the prophecy. For instance, Gomer became the Gemari, became the Cimmerians, became the Celts, became the Gauls. Now, when's the last time that you purchased or read a book called The Coming Irish Invasion of Israel? It doesn't sell very well, right? It doesn't read right. But it's not just Ireland. If you trace those names around, I think I've actually if you consistently use that bloodline, here's some of the nations that must be included. If you want to argue it's talking about Russia, fine. You have to include all of these other nations. The United States, England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, France, Canada, coming Canadian invasion of Israel. Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland, Norway, Finland, Sweden. There it is, Luxembourg, the coming Luxembourgian invasion of Israel. I'm talking Guatemala, South America, Mexico, all of the above. You have to include them all because that's the bloodline lineage migration method. Do you see what I'm saying? No one's doing that. They're just doing a selective approach. Okay, so what is the conclusion? What is the Issachar lesson then? If the prophet was pointing to modern-day Turkey, then how many of us are truly watching Turkey? How many are paying attention to what's taking place in Turkey? And this is the point, is I believe that if what I've just expounded upon is accurate, then we as discerning peoples who understand the times should be paying attention prayerfully as watchmen to the nation of Turkey. And I've been doing this for the past 10 years, along with several others. This past year, I've been working on a documentary. WorldNet Daily did the documentary for Tom Horn, and now in about a month, we're going to start editing the documentary I've been working on all year. And so in order to do that, trying to convey what's taking place in the Middle East as it relates to Bible prophecy, Myself and a small team had the chance. We were in Egypt, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Israel, in Bulgaria, and we were supposed to go into Iran, and that our visas were not accepted last minute because of the presidential elections. But what was amazing is that we were able to be in Turkey because we didn't get into Iran on a few days that were incredibly a historical moment for Turkey. So as the revolutions are sweeping across the Middle East, I had the chance to be part of history. I mean, to be literally right in the middle of it and to see it unfold. And so as these revolutions are taking place, there's been a protest movement that's broken out in Turkey as well. How many have been following that a little bit? So essentially what happened was the Islamist government that's been rising in Turkey since about 2002, the past 10, 11 years, has been increasingly enforcing Islamist laws onto the formerly very secular nation of Turkey. And a lot of the more secular folks are very upset with that. Just different things like they'll say, no alcohol after 10 o'clock at night can be served, and you can be fined. Like if you kiss your wife in public, you could be fined. No public display. So just gradual, and then beyond that, incredible cronyism. So the Islamist government gives all the projects, the contracts, and the jobs to the other Islamists, and everybody else suffers, right? So what began as this construction project, they were going to plow down a park right there in Taksim Square, Gezi Park, right in the heart of Istanbul, became an environmentalist protest, which ironically, the environmentalists basically just torched and burnt and vandalized all the construction equipment. It's so funny. But then what happened is the Islamist government just starts cracking down on the people. And then all these other people that have nothing to do with the environmentalist movement, they go, you don't treat people like that. And they start joining the protest in solidarity. And so this thing had been going on for about 2 weeks. When we got there, you can see some of the effects of the environmentalists as they had destroyed everything. It says, cops beware. I don't know why it says it in English. And so we were mulling around for the better part of the day. Now, when we got there, everyone said, oh, well, the protests are over. The organizers have met with the government. It's simmering down. What we didn't know was that was the night that the whole thing would come to a head. And we were caught right in the middle of an incredibly brutal crackdown on thousands of people. You've seen the police. They've got these water cannons mounted on the top of these trucks. Well, what they don't tell you is that it's not water. They put like tear gas chemicals into the water, and it's sticky. There's been hundreds of people that have gone blind from getting this in their eyes, and most of the people have masks and everything. Of course, we didn't, and because we're so smart, we're just like, hey, we're here, and anyway, and so this stuff, not only does it fill the air with a toxic mist, if it gets on you, it burns, and thousands of people have been hospitalized, and several people have died. I just loved this picture. Typical sort of liberal protester, he's out there. I thought it was so iconic, but we're so peaceful, kind of highlighting the irony. As night began encroaching, the protests really started to increase. You could feel the tension. Of course, the famous Guy Fawkes mask, which we've seen in all of the Occupy movement here in the States. It's all over the world. They were selling them, And there were thousands of people throughout the park. But you could feel the tension begin rising. And, of course, the majority of the people had some type of gas mask. A lot of people had good ones. Most of them didn't really work. They had like those little dust particle things. Like those are not going to do anything. Oh, here's let me jump back. Is the sound turned up? I just threw in a little video so you can just sort of get a feel for the power when things really started kicking into place. It was just the tension. You could just feel it was building, and that went on for about an hour or so. There was one shot just minutes before, basically all hell broke loose. So here's sort of the front lines where the protesters are all mounted up. And by the way, there's thousands of police in full riot gear all the way around the park. And then they started spraying. It just happened fast. They start spraying, and what happens is I was just like, oh, here comes the water cannons. But within seconds, 100 yards, it just fills the air, and you start coughing, and it just starts burning. You feel like it's sort of like a cayenne pepper chemical that's now inside of your lungs, and it's itching and it's burning. And so we started making our way out of the park. People are, thousands just running. We had all our equipment, so we were trying to go slow. There's another big shot. They just kind of just missed it over everybody at first. And I thought, well, they're just trying to chase everyone out of the park, right? They're just trying to get us out of here so they can clean up. And everyone's making their way out and clearing the park. Then came the tear gas grenades. It was like the conclusion of a 4th of July. Boom, 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 boom. And, people are getting killed from hitting the heads with these things. But we were surrounded by tear gas. And that stuff smells like burning rubber, except it burns like cayenne pepper. And one of the guys that we were with was ready to collapse. And so we're making our way out of the park down this street. And I thought, we just got to get to fresh air. Until we get about 30 feet down this alley, this street, and the cops are blocking the end of the street, and they start shooting tear gas at us. I'm like, they're going to kill us. I'm ready to pass out on the ground. I can't go back there. There's no fresh air. They're up here with clubs, and they're shooting at us. And just I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, and then there was a hotel right there, and everyone just poured into the hotel, and I practically just got carried in. And so we immediately went upstairs. My friend, who was one of the guys, a missionary in Turkey, he gets on Twitter with his Turkish phone, and he's like, the police are going in the hotels after people. They're releasing tear gas. Live feed, we're getting it as it goes. They're releasing tear gas in the hotel, which is illegal according to the Geneva Convention, by the way. You don't release chemical warfare in a building. And so I'm thinking, man, they're going to, I'm going to end up in the hospital tonight or whatnot. So the point is, it makes for a great man story. When it was all said and done, we eventually got out of there. But we got great footage, but we got to see the rise of the people. Now, what people have been asking me is they go, well, I'm following Turkey. Isn't this about to overthrow the Islamist government in Turkey? Aren't the people rising up? That's a good question. The problem is, the very next day, we went to a pro-government rally. Again, a historical response by the government to the protests. And when we were at the protests, there was probably 3,000 people or so. I think no. When we went to the pro-government rally, there were over 1 million. Okay? So yes, there's been protests in Turkey. Is it going to affect the elections coming up next year? I'm pretty skeptical. We'll see. I'm not claiming to make any predictions. But what I saw at the protests was significant. What I saw at the pro-government rally was unbelievable. Okay, so for about 4 hours, we made our way. They were busing people in from all over the country, all over the city. Free buses were free that day, by the way. And they bussed us into this giant clearing down by the water on the edge of Istanbul. And so for about 4 hours, we're out in the sun, surrounded by literally probably over 1 million Islamists. It was unbelievable. And obviously, I can blend in the Middle East pretty good, but with all the cameras, everyone's coming up. Where you from? And we would just kind of say, oh, from America. And they would be like, oh, some people are okay, and so we would just play the dumb American thing and be like, oh, Charcozel is very beautiful. Hey, hi. Just keep smiling. And they'd kind of leave us alone. A few teenage kids kind of tried to start some fights, but for the most part, but it was obvious they weren't happy that we were there, but we were filming. So for a few hours, the people were just chanting and cheering, and the main cheer throughout the day was Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which is the name of the prime minister. Okay? I'm talking 7 miles leading up to the event were just thousands of banners just lining the streets throughout the whole city. When we got there, you can see the banner of Erdogan in the background. Those things were 60 feet tall. They were just huge, and they surrounded this place, probably well over a mile circumference. It just went on forever, and there were the banners of it's called the AK Party, which is the Islamist party. This is the party that the United States is getting behind to support, trying to replicate throughout the region. And it was nationalism and the cult of personality unlike anything that you can even fathom. I mean, we were kind of like taken back by the rallies for Obama before he came in the first time, people fainting. I mean, it doesn't even begin to touch just the robust nationalism of the Turks. Everyone were chanting. Just went on. There's another picture of Erdogan. And then finally, after a few hours, there came the big culmination. He came up and started speaking. The only thing that I can say is that throughout the day, the whole time, I just felt like, just impressed upon me that I was at the equivalent of a Nazi rally, 1938, right on the edge of something, that just the energy in the air, I can't even really communicate to you. The nationalism was a volcano that was ready to explode. And now for a little bit of comedic interlude. After waiting all day, here comes Erdogan. Here's what happened. He's wearing my shirt. I was like, this guy's got some fine taste in clothing. And so he comes out, I'm like, look at this, he's wearing my shirt. So, and then anyway, literally a million, like when the drive-in movies get out, you're like, okay, let's go. So basically, we hung around for about 15 minutes. He probably talked for 2 hours. It took us hours just to walk through the people. I mean, they just went on and on and on. I'm guessing there was a million. There may have been more. It was unbelievable. It was absolutely unbelievable. And just the masculine bravado, if you know Turkish culture, it's very masculine anyway, but it was not like conciliatory, like, yes, these protesters have some valid. It was just like, these ingrates, these scumbags, we're not going to let them crush the Turkish spirit. And then after the rally, there was AK party folks that went up to the protest and just started, kicking people, stomping them in the streets. And, on Twitter, we got this one. It was some poor Swedish tourist. He's like, some guy just came up, threw me on the ground, kicked me in the face, and was yelling, Allahu Akbar. And he's probably just like coming to see Istanbul and see the nightlife or whatever. But if he was even near the protests. So anyway, it was just a historical moment. And again, I'll deal with that a bit more in the documentary when it comes out next year. But I just wanted you to get a feel for what's taking place in Turkey, because believe me, when I say that it felt like Zeppelin Tribune Field. It was intense, and the world needs to be watching Turkey. They need to understand what's going there. The difference between Erdogan, the difference between Turkey and Iran, by the way, they both want to rule the whole region. They both have regional aspirations. Of course, Turkey did it for 500 years, right up until 1923. The difference is the Turkish method. The Iranians, they say death to America, death to Israel, we're going to wipe them off the map, and they get sanctions, and they get treated like pariahs as they should. The Turks, on the other hand, what they do is they use the model of interfaith dialogue, and they talk about, the moderate type of Islam, and they use all the language, and we just roll the red carpet out for them. So while, Ahmadinejad and the Ayatollahs, they get sanctions, when Erdogan comes to Washington, he gets a big hug from the president. Okay, that's the difference. Same goals, different methods. One method is much more effective, and it's working. And so the rise of Turkey in the region is something to watch. Now, there's a picture, by the way. There's an aerial photo of the rally. Personally, I don't even feel like that begins to convey what a dramatic event it was. Now we want to touch on, when does Gog of Magog take place? How do we determine when it takes place? So now we've established that Turkey is centrally featured in the prophecy, but is it the Antichrist or is it a preliminary guy? And the way that we can determine that is by looking at the events within the text that occur as a direct result of the destruction of the armies of Gog of Magog. Does that make sense? So he lays out, he says, after these armies are destroyed, here's what's going to happen. And by looking at these events, we can clearly lay where it takes place within the prophetic timeline. The first thing is that after the destruction of these armies, the passage says God's name will no longer be blasphemed. I'll show my greatness and my holiness. I'll make myself known in the eyes of many nations. They will know that I am the Lord. My holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel. I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore. So now, if this takes place back at the beginning of the 7 years, or sometime near the beginning, and yet the Antichrist is about to rise up, and what does the Antichrist do? He blasphemes the name of God for 42 months. He speaks unheard of things against the Most High, and he raises up a global movement of followers who will do the same. How can you say, back at the beginning of the 7 years, God's no longer going to let his name be blasphemed or profaned, just before the greatest blasphemy movement in the history of the world? That doesn't work, does it? Unless you say that the ceasing of profanity and blasphemy takes place at the return of Jesus, at the very end, and the destruction of the enemies of God, then it makes sense. But it's incredibly difficult to try to reconcile this with the popular view. The Gentiles come to know God. Ezekiel 39, 6 through 7. I will send fire on Magog and those who dwell securely in the coastlands. They will know that I am the Lord. The Gentiles, the nations, shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. So the nations come to know the Lord. When do the nations come to know the Lord? Before the beginning of the 7 years or at the end? When do all the Gentiles finally come to acknowledge him, those that are left? It's certainly not at the beginning. You could argue that it's throughout. You could say, well, they're coming to know him, but this is the result of a massive victory of the Lord in the land of Israel. The nations come to know the Lord. Not only that, but Israel comes to know God forevermore. So the house of Israel, 39 verse 22, shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day forward. When does Israel get saved? At the beginning of the 7 years, or when they look upon the one they have pierced? From that day forward. And this is not just like, well, they acknowledge that Yahweh's their God as opposed to, Shiva or some hint. No, it's not just like they acknowledge that Yahweh's. No, they come to know him. This is eternal life, that you would know the one who sent me. Israel will dwell securely in their land. Ezekiel 39, 26 through 28. At the destruction of those armies, after that, it says this is speaking of Israel, they will forget their shame, all the treachery they have practiced against me. When did they practice this treachery? When they dwelt securely in their land with none to make them afraid. That's present day. And I will leave none of them remaining among the nations anymore. No more diaspora. They're all now back in the land, and they're no longer falsely secure. They are now genuinely secure. How can you say that's going to take place just before the Antichrist and the nations invade the land of Israel? Again, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, this is the passage in Zechariah. We're familiar with it. Zechariah 12, 9 through 11. This is when all Israel comes to be saved, when they come to know him. On that day, I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Okay, so you have the invading nations, the same motif that's in Ezekiel. And I will pour out on the house of David, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, a spirit of grace and it pleads for mercy. They have repentance when they look upon me, on him whom they have pierced. And they will mourn, they weep bitterly. And then there's this repentance, okay? So you have the three elements. The Lord destroys the invading nations, and the Jewish people come to recognize the one they have pierced. It's Jesus. It's not just, there's no way you can get around it that it's anything less than genuine salvation. And the Lord pours out his Spirit on his people, okay? We all agree that comes at the very end. Well, Ezekiel 39:28, all the same elements. You have the invading nations are destroyed, and then he says, I will not hide my face anymore from them when I pour out my Spirit upon the house of Israel. This happens as a direct result of the destruction of the armies of Gog of Magog. Israel, he pours out his Spirit on them. It's the same thing that Zechariah is speaking of. It's the same thing that Zechariah is speaking of. The Messiah himself is present. I call this passage the parousia of the Old Testament. It is the return of Jesus of the Old Testament. In my jealousy and in my blazing wrath, I declare on that day, there'll be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. At the destruction of Ezekiel's armies, of Gog's armies, there's a great earthquake. When does the great earthquake take place? When his feet land on the Mount of Olives. It's mentioned in the book of Revelation when he comes back. The fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, and all the creeping things, chihuahuas and such, All the people who are on the face of the earth will quake at my presence. What is the word presence? Are they quaking at the thought of me, says the Lord? Are they quaking at my glory, my panim? It means literal presence. It means his face. Okay? Jacob wrestles with God. I have seen God panim to panim. All right? I will quake. It means actual presence. Now, here's another passage to back that up. Ezekiel 39, verse 7. My holy name, I'll make it known in the midst of my people Israel. I will not let my name be profaned anymore, and the nations will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Now, we all know the phrase, the Holy One of Israel. That's used about 25 times throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Kadosh, Kadosh, Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. Only one time in all of the Hebrew Scriptures is the phrase, Kadosh, Kadosh, Ba Yisrael, in Israel used, and that's right here. The nations will know that I am the Holy One in Israel. On the land, feet on the ground, great earthquake. This is the return of Jesus of the Old Testament. Do you see what I'm saying? God directly declares that Gog is the Antichrist. 38 verse 17, he says, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Are you not the one that I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel? He goes, look, you're the guy that all the other prophets are talking about. At that time, they prophesied for years that I would bring you against them. Now, I've set this out, and I've said, okay, if you want to argue that this passage is talking about a preliminary battle involving Russia, then show me a single other verse in any of the other prophets that's clearly talking about this. And, you know, some people will go, well, maybe, possibly Daniel 11, but then all these other guys go, no, Daniel 11 is clearly the Antichrist. You know, they'll point to passages which are arguably antichristic passages. And then one guy came out and said, well, obviously the Bible says it, so we know it's true, but the only conclusion we can arrive at is that these are prophets that never made it into the Bible. I'm like, so you know it's true, but there's no evidence, and that's what you're going to bank on? He says, you're the guy that all the prophets, all the post-exil, you know, the guys that came before Ezekiel, the pre-Ezekiel prophets, you're the same one that they're all talking about. I said I would bring you against my land in the last days. Now, as I set this out, a lot of people will be like, Joel, it's contrary, it's not traditional. It's not true. It's just not widely taught. Here's a quote from our beloved Dave Hunt. Ezekiel 38 and 39 refer to Armageddon, and not to some earlier World War III. There is no doubt from both Zechariah 12 and Revelation 1 and 19 that this personal coming of Yahweh to rescue his people and destroy Antichrist and his armies takes place in Armageddon. It's significant then that similar language concerning the personal presence of God is found in Ezekiel 38-39, thus identifying the event there described as Armageddon also. Okay, so I'm not alone in this. I want to be clear. I'm not just some renegade teaching something. Who else? Charles Ryrie. The consummation, this is from the Ryrie Study Bible on Ezekiel 38-39. The consummation of this battle involves the birds and the beasts eating the flesh of warriors. A scene similar to the destruction of Armageddon at the end of tribulation. In fact, as I said, Revelation 19 is essentially quoting from Ezekiel 38-39. And it would be awfully confusing if they were two completely separate events. Also, at the conclusion of the conflict, the nations will understand the judging hand of God. Israel will know the Lord is their God. Perhaps the first thrust will begin in the middle of the tribulation with successive waves, essentially culminating at Armageddon. That's what I believe. That Ezekiel 38-39 is not necessarily Armageddon specifically, but it's involving a broad period. It begins with God placing the thought in Gog's mind to invade, and it concludes with the Messiah on the ground. So it's speaking of a broad period of time. Admittedly, it reads like a brief event. But this is the nature of prophecy. This is the way it always works, you know. Unto us a child is born, a son is given. Oh, what's he going to do? He's going to heal people. He's going to die. The government will be on his shoulders. Just boom, you know. And the Jews look at that and they go, where's all this other stuff? When the child is born, he will rule. And we go, no, you dumb Jews. There's a 2,000-year gap. You just can't see it. And they're like, I don't see it. And you're like, it's there. You know, I mean, this is just, so if we can look at in one sentence, you've got 2,000 years, at least. It's the same thing with Ezekiel. It's speaking of a fairly broad time frame, and it's easy to understand that when you look at the events, but it does read as a fairly brief event. Cyrus Scofield, that destruction shall fall, he's speaking of Ezekiel 38, at the climax of the last mad attempt to exterminate the remnant of Israel in Jerusalem. The whole prophecy belongs to the yet future day of Jehovah and to the battle of Armageddon. John Nelson Darby, Gog is the end of all the dealings of God with respect to Israel, and that God brings up this haughty power in order to manifest on earth by a final judgment his dealings with Israel and with the Gentiles, to plant his blessing in the midst of Israel. So the point is this. I just wanted to throw that out just so you know I'm not a renegade. This is commonly seen and recognized by many other very well-respected teachers. I believe we need to get back to this understanding, because I think when we lose this and we're embracing that traditional position that Islam is about to be wiped out, I think it puts us in great danger of delusion and also just giving ourselves to things that, the greatest need in the earth right now are missionaries to the Islamic world. I mean, that is white unto harvest. That field is white unto harvest. There are more Muslims coming to faith. I mean, I could tell you stories of things taking place in Egypt and of course in Iran. We interviewed underground pastor from Iran. The unbelievable revivals breaking out, right? And then you've got people saying, no, that whole part of the world's about to be just reduced to ashes. That's dangerous. I want to just look at a few quotes. Again, popular prophecy teachers, I'm not naming them, I'm not picking on them, but I just want you to see the application if we take the popular position. This guy says the war of Psalm 83, followed by the war of Ezekiel 38, will result in the annihilation of nearly all the armies of the Muslim nations of the Middle East. And now he's actually picking on me specifically. Thus, if the Antichrist is a Muslim who is going to rule a Muslim empire in the Middle East during the tribulation, he's going to rule over a part of the world, an empire that has been reduced to ashes. Okay, so the whole Middle East is going to be annihilated, and all of those nations are going to be reduced to ashes. That's a dramatic thing to claim. That is a dramatic thing to claim. I believe that Ezekiel 38, this is another guy, through 39, war plays a key role in the rise of the Antichrist. I believe God will use this war to bring the ultimate downfall of the Islamic religion and the false god Allah. I agree, but not in our day and not imminently. Now, I confronted one of these teachers and I said, listen, I have a close friend. My very small church is sending a family out to be missionaries to Jordan with their little ones, to be missionaries, to give themselves to the Islamic world. You're saying that whole part of the world is about to be reduced to ashes. Do I tell him to go or not? What do you say? And he refused to answer. Because the bottom line is, when we teach this, it is destructive to the motivation to go preach the gospel among Muslims. But when we recognize that Islam's not going away, folks, it's in fact the greatest final challenge that the church globally is going to face, that it's only going to build and it will be destroyed by Jesus when He returns, yes. Then we can say, are we going to rise to meet the challenge, or are we going to hide out in a bunker? Now, some will be called to build bunkers unto the gospel, unto the salvation of those during the difficult times ahead. Okay, there will be those that will be called to build places of refuge so that they can minister to those in crisis, yes. But the calling of the church is to proclaim the gospel. Listen, I want to go down with my boots on. I want to die with my boots on. And when I say that, I mean, I want my feet to be shod with the preparation of the gospel. I want to be proclaiming the gospel. The church needs to recognize that this Islam thing is not going away, and we need to rise to meet the challenge. Amen? Amen.